Friends, our today's read is The Valley of Flowers by Frank S. Smith. Now let us read about something about the book. In 1931, a party of British mountaineers, including Frank S. Smith, on their way back from a successful ascent of Mount Kamet, were looking for shelter from inclement weather in the wilderness above the Joshimath in the present day Uttarakhand, when they came upon the lush and colorful Bhayandar Valley, the Valley of Flowers. In the monsoon of 1937, Smith returned to the valley with four Tibetans from Darjeeling, his climbing partners, and factorums, provisions, and 6 weeks of leisure. On his adventure, Smith extensively explored the valley, identifying, collecting flowers and seeds from among the wealth of plant life. He and his friends also scaled the Nilgiri Parbat and Mana Peak and were defeated by Mount Rataban. Beset by the rains, the party was nearly always soggy, and once an abdominal snowman gave him the fight of their lives. Yet they were but minor prices to pay for the privilege of witnessing the Himalayas in its infinite variety, and for a great deal of time usefully spent ruminating on the joys of idleness. The very best kind of nature and adventure writing, which vividly captures the exuberance of wide open vistas of mountains of Himalayas, as well as the opportunities for solitude and introspection they provide. The Valley of Flower is the perfect book to read and keep returning to. Preface. This is the story of 4 happy months spent amidst some of the noblest and most beautiful mountains in the world. Its inception dates back to 1931. In the year Kamet, a mountain 25,447 feet high, situated in the Garhwal Himalayas, was climbed by a small expedition of 6 British mountaineers, of whom I was one. After the climb, we descended to the village of Ghamsali in the Dhauli valley, then crossed the Zasar range, which separates the upper Dhauli and Alaknanda valley by the Bhayandar Pass, 16,688 feet, with the intention of exploring the mountains regions at the sources of the two principal tributaries of Ganges, the Alaknanda and Gangotri rivers. The monsoon had broken and the day was crossed. The pass was wet, cold, and miserable. Below 16,000 feet, rain was falling, but above that height, there was sleet or snow. A bitter wind drove at us, sheeting our clothing with wet snow and chilling us to the bone. And as quickly as possible, we descended into the Bhayandar Valley, which bifurcates with the Alaknanda Valley. Within a few minutes, we were out of the wind and in the rain, which became gradually warmer as we lost height. Dense mist shrouded the mountainside, and we had paused uncertain as to the route when I heard R.L. Horsworth, who was a botanist as well as a climbing member of the expedition, exclaim, "Look, I found the direction of his outstretched hand." At first I could see nothing but rocks, then suddenly my wandering gaze was arrested by a little splash of blue, and beyond it were other splashes of blue, a blue so intense it seemed to light the hillside. As Holsworth wrote, all of a sudden I realized that I was simply surrounded by primulas. At once the day seemed to brighten perceptibly. Forgotten were all pains and cold and lost porters. And what a primula it was! Its leek like habit proclaimed it a member of Nizalis section. All over the little shelves and terraces it grew, often with its in running water. At the most it stood 6 inches high, but its flowers were enormous for its structure and ample in number, sometimes as many as 30 to to the beautifully proportioned umbel, and it in color of the most heavenly French blue, sweetly scented. In all my mountain wanderings, I had not seen a more beautiful flower than this primula. The fine raindrops clung to its soft petals like galaxies of seed pearls and frosted its leaf with silver. Lower where we camped near a moraine were and androses, saxifrages, sedums, yellow and red potentialas, guillaumes, geraniums, asters, gentians, to mention but a few plants, and it was impossible to take a step without crushing a flower. Next day we descended to lush meadows. Here our camp was embowered amidst flowers, snow white drifts of anemones, golden lily like nomocaries, marigolds, glow flowers, delphiniums, violets, uh, erichiums, blue cordialis, wild roses, flowering shrubs, and rhododendrons. Many of them flowers with homely sounding English names. The Bhayandar Valley was the most beautiful valley that any of us had seen. We camped in it for 2 days and we remembered it afterwards as the Valley of Flowers. Often in dark winter days, I wander in spirit in these flowerful pastures with their clear running streams set against a frieze of silver birches and shining snow peaks. Then once again I saw the slow passage of the breeze through the flowers and heard the external note of glacier's torrent coming to the campfire through the star-filled night. After many years in London, I went to live in the country where I set to work to make a garden out of a field of thistles, ragwort, and dandelions. I had looked on gardening as an old man's hobby and a dull and unremunerative labor, but I came upon something that Carol Capek had written. You must have a garden before you know what you are treading on. Then, dear friend, you will see that not even clouds are so diverse, so beautiful and terrible as the soil under your feet. I tell you that the I tell you that to tame a couple of rods of soil is a great victory. Now it lies there, workable, crumbly, and humid. You are almost jealous of the vegetation which will take hold of this noble and humane work which is called the soil. So I became a gardener, but I was profoundly ignorant. 2.5 years ago, I did not know the difference between a biennial and a perennial. I am still ignorant, for there is no to ignorance or knowledge in gardening. But I discovered one thing, that there is freemasonry among gardeners, which places gardening on pinnacle above jealousy and suspicion. Perhaps this is because it is essentially a creative task and bring out a fine quality of patience. You may hasten the growth of a constitution, but you cannot hasten the growth of alpine plant. In 1937, the opportunity came to return to Bhayandar Valley. I travelled alone for several reasons, but it was arranged that Captain P.R. Oliver of the Southern Waziristan Scout should join me towards the end of July, and he and I should spend 2 months mountaineering in the Garhwal Himalayas, after which I should return to the valley to collect seeds, bulbs, tubers, and plants. Thus, I should have 6 weeks on my own before and during the monsoon season, and to help me, I engaged through kind of offices of Mr. W. J. Kivd of Darjeeling, 4 Tibetan porters, of whom the Sirdar Wangdi Nurbu of or Undi was an oldest friend of mine. One reason of this small party was that after 4 large and elaborately organized Himalayan expedition, I welcomed the opportunity of taking a Himalayan holiday, a very different affair from an attempt to climb one of the major peaks of the world and involving an entity different scale of values both human and material. The ascent of Mount Everest has become a duty, perhaps a national duty comparable with attempts to reach the poles, and is far moved from pleasurable mountaineering. Mountaineering in Garhwal and Kumaon Himalayas more nearly resembles mountaineering in Switzerland, for here are mountains and valleys like Swiss mountains and valleys, but built on greater scale. But unlike parts of Switzerland, the country is unspoiled by commercialism. There are no railways, power lines, roads, and hotels to offend the eyes and distract and detract from primitive beauty and grandeur of the vistas. And there are peaks innumerable, unnamed and unclimbed, of all shades of difficulty, and valleys that have never been seen a European, where a simple, kindly peasant folk gaze their flocks in the summer months. Then the flowers from the hot valley in the south, moist and humid during the monsoon season, to the golden hills of Tibet with their dry, cold winds, there is much to tempt the imagination of the gardener and the botanist. Yet, strangely enough, little collecting has been done since the years between 1846 and 1849, with Sir Richard Strachey and J. E. Winterbottom made their famous collection of specimens. It was left to R. L. Holsworth in 1931 to point out potentialities of this floral storehouse, and in Camet Concord he wrote, there are many enthusiastic gardeners who, I feel sure, would welcome these Himalayas high alpines, and I write this in the hope that some enterprising philanthropist will go and get seed or plants not merely of the easier, bigger species from the comparatively low down, but of many a shy primulas and gentians which haunts the most austere heights of that wonderful world. It was my privilege to undertake this work, and the reader, while remembering that I hope generously, my ignorance must judge for himself whether the Bhayandar Valley deserves its title, the Valley of Flowers. Others will visit it, analyze it, and probe it, but whatever their opinions, to me it will remain the Valley of Flowers, a valley of peace and perfect beauty where human spirit may find repose. The Valley of Flowers. On June 1st, I arrived at Ranikhet from Nainital, where I had stayed with Sir Harry Haig, the governor of the United Province, and Lady Haig. Sir Harry was then president of the Himalayan Club, and he very kindly promised to do everything in his power to help me, while Lady Haig, who is an enthusiastic gardener, has done much to beautify the already beautiful surroundings of the government house at Nainital. Ranikhet is a hill station situated at about 5,000 feet on the foothills ridge, which commands a view of the central Himalayas, from the peaks of western Nepal to the snows of Badrinath and Tehri Garhwal, comparable in beauty, grandeur, and extent to the celebrated views of Kanchenjunga from Darjeeling. In a single sweep, the eye ranges from east to west past Nandakot, 22,530 feet, climbed in 1936 by a Japanese expedition; Nanda Devi, 25,645 feet, the highest peak in the British administered territory, and thus, strictly speaking, in the British Empire, which was climbed in 1936 by the Anglo American expedition; Trisul, 23,360 feet, climbed by Dr. T. J. Longstaff in 1907, which remained the highest summit to have been reached until 1930, when the Jongsong Peak, 24,344 feet, was climbed by the International Kanchenjunga Expedition. Then the great massif of Hathi Parbat, 22,070 feet, and Gauri Parbat, 22,027 feet, with Nilgiri Parbat, 21,264 feet behind and slightly to the west, and Mana Peak, 23,860 feet, and Kamet, 25,447 feet, nearly 100 miles distant, and so westward to the snow of Badrinath, 23,420 feet, with Nilkant, 21,640 feet, one of the most beautiful peaks in the Himalayas, standing alone, and the far snows of Tehri Garhwal, where much interesting exploration remains to be done. This vast wall of mountains is the best seen in the clear atmosphere of mornings before the clouds formed by the hot moist air currents from the valley have obscured it, and many times I had risen early to look over the foothills, dim and shadowy in the twilight, to the snows hung like a glowing curtain across the whole width of the northern sky, yet so remote it seemed no human foot could have tread there, or auroral steeps. It is in these moments of awakening, when not a bird tweets from the forest and the sun steps from the peak to peak slowly and in splendid strides, that the sage words ring true. In 100 ages of the god, I could not tell thee of the glories of the Himachal. At Ranikhet, I was joined by the 4 Tibetans from the Darjeeling. I had already mentioned Wangdi Nurbu. He will be familiar to some readers as the man who fell into a crevasse at Kanchenjunga and remained in it for 3 hours before he was found. He was badly knocked about and was sent down to the base camp to be cared for by the doctor. By 2 days later, insisted on returning to the highest camp. Then on Everest in 1933 he was taken ill and double pneumonia and was sent down to the lower valley in an apparently dying condition, only to reappear at the base camp 1 month later carrying a heavy load on his back and clamoring for work on the mountain. Such is the spirit of the man. He is a little fellow, all bones and wiriness, but does not carry an ounce of superfluous flesh, and has one of the hardest countenance I had ever seen. He looks tough, but in point of fact he is sober and law abiding. He has less pronounced cheekbones than many Tibetans, and his lips are thinner and firmer. His eyes are usually slightly bloodshot with whites, which gives him a ferocious, almost cruel look. But Wangdi is not cruel. He is merely hard on the hardest man I know, and fit to enter a select uh, coterie of Bhutia and Sherpas potters, which included men such as Saturn Chetan, who was killed on Kanchenjunga, and Leva, the Sirdar of the Kamet expedition, not to mention that pock-marked piece of granite, Lobsang, who distinguished himself on Everest and Kanchenjunga, but who has unhappily since died. Wangdi is illiterate, but in addition to his native language, he can speak fluent Urdu and Nepali. He is quick and jerky in action and in speech. It is as though some fire burns within him can never properly find a vent. Like many of his race, he is an excellent handyman, but failing his kukri curved Gorkha knife, prefers to use his teeth, and I had seen him place his recalcitrant screw of camera tripod between them and turn his tripod with the screw as it as an axis until the latter was loosened, then calmly spit out such pieces of his teeth as it has ground off in the process. Last but by no means least, he is a fine climber on Everest. In 1936, he jumped automatically into the lead of the porter's columns on the North Col and was never so happy as when exercising his magnificent strength and undoubted skill. Pasang with his high cheekbones and slanting eyes, is a true Tibetan type, a tall, stringy man with thin, spindly legs. He somehow suggested clumsiness, and undoubtedly he was clumsy on a mountain, particularly on snow, so that when climbing with him I had always to be on my guard against a slip. I think he must have been something of a fatalist, for whenever he did slip, the first thing he did was to let go of his ice axe, the one thing by which he might have stopped himself, and leave it to God or his companions to decide whether or not he should continue to slide into the next world. But this passivity was exasperating was but though this passivity was exasperating at times, I liked Pasang. He might give the impression of being a lout, but there was plenty of common sense packed away behind his ungainly exterior, and he was to be trusted on other matters but climbing. His knave awkwardness, and I think of no better way of putting it, betokened a nature free from all guile, and he was ever ready and willing to do his best, however uncomfortable the condition in a rain soaked camp or on a storm lashed mountainside. He was no leader and had gone off the fire vivaciousness on he was no leader and had none of the fire, vivaciousness, or conscious toughness of Wangdi. Where others went, he was prepared to follow. But there was something solid and enduring about his character, and the quick smile that unexpectedly illuminated his normally solemn countenance was a sure indication of kindliness. Tewang, an older stager and one of the men who climbed to Camp V on Everest in 1924, Hugh Rutledge wrote to him in Everest 1933 that efficient, completely reliable, and never idle, he performed every office from porter, messman to nurse in a manner beyond praise. Undoubtedly, he was aging, for he had become heavy, and it was apparently that he would be of little use in difficult mountaineering and would have to be relegated to the base camp as sheet anchor of the party. Age tells quickly to on Tibetans, perhaps because they wear themselves out when they are young, or it may be that the height at which they live has something to do with a rapid deterioration in their physique at a period when a European is in his prime. He was of an even quieter disposition than Pasang, and always slower than his companions. You could see this in his heavy face and lumbering gait. I scarcely ever saw him smile, but there was a natural fatherliness about him which could have chosen him automatically as a nurse, as it did in 1933 had there been any nursing to do. Nurbu was the youngster of the party. He had been Major C.J. Morris' servant on Everest in 1936, and the training he had then received had stood him in good stead, for he was the most efficient servant I had ever had. A good looking lad with a sound, boyish, and remarkably smooth skinned face. He was invariably cheerful and quick to seize upon the and to seize upon and remember anything to do with his job. He had had little or no mountaineering experience and came to me as a raw novice at the craft. But he was a natural climber, neat and careful, particularly on rocks, on which he was a cat-like in his agility and, unlike many of his type, quick to learn the finer points of mountaineering, such as handling the rope, cutting step in the snow and ice. Himalayan mountaineering will hear more of him in the future, and I venture the prophecy that he puts upon a good showing on Everest in 1938. Such were my companions. I cannot think of them as porters, and I could scarcely have wished for better. They contributed generously and in many measures to the pleasure and success of the happiest holiday of my life. 3 days of Ranikhet sufficed to complete my preparations, but I might not have got away so expeditiously had it not been for the help given me by Mrs. Eleven Brown, whom many Himalayan mountaineers will remember with gratitude, while my short stay was rendered additionally pleasant by the kindness of Major Brown, the secretary of the club. On June 4th, my arrangement was completed, and 11 Dortial porters of a race indigenous to southern Nepal had arrived to carry my heavy luggage to the base camp. So at last the dream of several years was on the verge of practical fulfillment.